On the morning the letter arrived, every girl in the dormitory laughed. Not quiet laughter, not the polite kind that hides behind hands. The full, ugly kind, heads thrown back, mouths open, the sound bouncing off the high windows of the Methodist home for unfortunate girls like something that wanted to escape. 12 girls, ranging from 10 to 17, all of them watching me, all of them laughing. Even the matrons by the door were smiling, though they tried to hide it. Mrs. Hargrove stood at the front of the room, holding a letter that had arrived that morning from a lawyer in Parsons, West Virginia. She was a small woman, dry as old paper, with a steel gray bun pulled so tight it stretched the skin at her temples. She had a permanent expression of mild distaste, as if life itself gave off a faintly unpleasant odor. When the laughter finally died down, she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Whitmore, it seems your grandmother's final gift is a pile of frozen sticks and a reputation for madness. I suppose even the dead can play cruel jokes on the living." I was 16 years old. I had 77 cents to my name, the entirety of my savings from selling embroidery scraps to the dry goods store in town. My father had died 3 years earlier in the Newburgh mine collapse, buried under half a mountain of rock and coal. My mother had followed him 6 months later, coughing blood onto the same quilt where I'd been born. 4 months with my father's brother Vernon, who drank and called me the burden, and eventually traded my labor to the church charity home for forgiveness of a tavern debt. 7 months at the Methodist home, where I learned to sew, to cook, and to say nothing. 5 months with the Aldridge family, who needed a girl to tend their invalid mother and didn't need opinions from that girl about anything, and who sent me back when the mother died. 3 months back at the Methodist home, where Mrs. Hargrove told me I was nearly too old to place and suggested I consider domestic service in Baltimore. I read. That was my sin. Not just the Bible and the domestic manuals the home provided, but anything I could find: newspapers, agricultural bulletins, engineering pamphlets I salvaged from the trash bins behind the Grafton Library. Mrs. Hargrove hated my reading. She called it vanity. She wasn't entirely wrong about the danger, I suppose. Reading makes you believe that the world contains more possibilities than the one you've been assigned. The inheritance was 47 acres of steep, rocky hillside in Tucker County, in the high Alleghenies near the headwaters of the Cheat River. The land included a half-collapsed cabin, a ruined woodshed, and creek frontage choked with willow thickets. The locals called it the Witch's Nest, both for the strange woven structures scattered across the property and for the reputation of the woman who had lived there. She had spent 30 years weaving enormous baskets instead of farming, talking to herself while measuring wind with strips of cloth, predicting storms with uncanny accuracy. The men of Tucker County said she was touched in the head. The women said she was something worse. She had bought the land in 1854 for $11 at a tax sale after the previous owner abandoned it following one winter. $11 for 47 acres. That should tell you what the land was worth. The letter said I was her only living heir. It said I could take possession immediately. It said I should understand that the property carried certain local associations that might prove challenging for a young woman of limited means. The girls were still laughing. Mrs. Hargrove was already folding the letter, already moving on to the morning's announcements, already dismissing me and my inheritance as a footnote to the day's business. But something was happening inside me, something I hadn't felt in 3 years, maybe ever. 47 acres. Mine. Not borrowed, not temporary, not dependent on someone else's charity or patience, a place where no one could send me away. Something lit up inside me, not a match, but a furnace. If you want to find out what I built on those 47 acres of frozen sticks and madness, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but 77 cents and a carpetbag of stolen library bulletins turned the Witch's Nest into something that saved an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I wove on that mountain, what I learned from the grandmother I never met, is a story that still stands in those hills today. I left Grafton 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to be rid of the problem I represented, a girl too old to place easily, too stubborn to mold, and now the owner of property that might as well have been cursed. I carried everything I owned in a single carpet bag: 2 dresses, my mother's Bible, and a packet of library bulletins I'd stolen from the trash bins in town. The train to Parsons took 3 hours and smelled like coal smoke and wet wool. I sat on a bench, meant for luggage because the regular seats cost extra, and I had 77 cents to my name. The mountains rose around us as we climbed, each ridge darker and more forested than the last. I'd never seen land this steep. Back in Grafton, the hills rolled. Here they stabbed upward like broken teeth. A man in a conductor's uniform walked past me twice without speaking. The third time, he stopped. "You getting off at Parsons?" "Yes, sir." He looked at my carpet bag, at my dress that was clean but mended in 3 places, at my hands that were rough from scrubbing the Methodist home's floors. "You got people there?" "I have property," I said. The word felt strange in my mouth, foreign, like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. He laughed, not unkindly. "Property up in Tucker County. That's a new one." He moved on, still chuckling. The train pulled into Parsons at 4:30. The town was smaller than I expected. A general store, a church with a white steeple, a handful of houses clustered around a single muddy street. Mountains pressed in from every direction, so close it felt like standing at the bottom of a bowl. The air was different here, thinner, colder, even though it was only October. I found a man with a wagon who agreed to take me up the mountain for 20 cents. His name was Hendricks, and he spoke maybe 6 words during the entire 4-hour journey. The road, if you could call it that, switchbacked up the western slope of what he called Backbone Mountain. With each turn, the drop-off grew steeper, and the trees pressed closer. The wagon lurched over roots and rocks. Twice I thought we'd tip over the edge. After 3 hours, Hendricks pulled the mules to a stop. "This is as far as I go." I looked around. There was nothing but forest. "But the property?" "Another 2 miles up that track." He pointed to a path so overgrown I hadn't seen it. "Past the Brennan place. You'll know it when you see it." He paused. "Though I'd advise you not to stay long after dark." "Why not?" He didn't answer. Just waited until I climbed down with my carpet bag, then turned the wagon around and headed back the way we'd come. I watched until he disappeared around a bend. Then I was alone. The silence was enormous. I'd never heard anything like it. No wagons, no voices, no bells. Just wind in the trees and my own breathing. I started walking. The track was barely visible under fallen leaves and encroaching brush. My boots, the good ones I'd saved for 3 years, sank into mud that hadn't dried in what looked like weeks. I walked for an hour, maybe more. The light was fading, turning the forest into a maze of shadows. I was starting to think I'd missed the property entirely when the trees opened up and I saw it. The witch's nest. They hadn't lied about that name. The cabin sat in a small clearing, and it looked like something that had been assembled by a madwoman. The roof sagged in the middle like a swayback horse. Half the shingles were missing, and the chimney leaned at an angle that made me wonder how it still stood. But that wasn't what made my breath catch. It was the wicker. Everywhere I looked, there were woven structures in various states of decay. An archway over what might once have been a garden, a half-collapsed tunnel leading to a shed, strange curved walls tangled into fence posts, spiraling shapes wrapped around dead tree trunks. Some were collapsed completely, just piles of rotting sticks. Others still held their form, curved and organic-looking, like the skeletons of enormous baskets. Like something had died here and left its bones behind. The air smelled like leaf rot and old smoke and something else, a dry, papery smell I couldn't identify. Ancient, dusty. The smell of things left too long alone. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. The light was almost gone now, just a thin orange line along the western ridge. The cabin looked less like shelter than warning. Every sensible instinct I had said to turn around, walk back to Parsons, beg Mrs. Hargrove to take me back. Then I looked at the wicker arch over the garden, and something shifted inside me. Not a thought, exactly. A feeling. Like recognition. Someone had built this. Someone had spent years out here alone, weaving these strange structures, and they'd had a reason. Everyone in Parsons thought she was crazy. Everyone at the Methodist home thought this inheritance was a cruel joke. What if they were wrong? I walked toward the cabin. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, something small and fast skittered across the floor. Mice. The cabin was one large room with a loft above, divided by function rather than walls. A cook stove squatted in one corner, its pipe extending through a hole in the roof that was surrounded by water stains. A bed frame stood against the far wall, its mattress reduced to mouse-chewed stuffing. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a set of shelves holding jars so dusty I couldn't see what was inside them. The floor was packed dirt. The walls were chinked with mud and straw, and I could see daylight through gaps where the chinking had fallen away. But the stove looked intact, and the roof, at least over this half of the cabin, appeared solid enough. I found a candle stub on the table and lit it with matches I'd stolen from the Methodist home's kitchen. The light revealed more details. A calendar on the wall from 1884, 3 years out of date. A pair of spectacles on the table, one lens cracked. A wool blanket folded on the bed frame, moth-eaten but still serviceable. And in the corner, half buried under debris from a section of collapsed roof, a cedar chest. I stared at it for a long moment. The rest of the cabin felt abandoned, forgotten, but the cedar chest looked deliberate, like someone had placed it there carefully under the one part of the roof that had held. I dragged it into the intact portion of the cabin. It was heavy, heavier than I expected. The lid was stuck, and I had to pry at it with a kitchen knife I found in a drawer. When it finally opened, the smell that rose up made my eyes sting. Cedar and paper and something else. Something preserved. Notebooks. 17 of them, stitched together from scrap paper with linen thread. Each one was filled with small, careful handwriting in faded ink. There were bundles of letters tied with string, dried willow samples pressed between sheets of newspaper, diagrams drawn on the backs of feed store receipts. And at the top of it all, a package wrapped in brown paper, addressed in that same careful handwriting. Miss Cora Whitmore, Methodist Home for Unfortunate Girls. Grafton, West Virginia. I picked it up. The paper was soft with age, the edges worn. The address was my name, written by someone who had never met me. The package had never been opened. It had been returned at some point and placed here in this chest. Someone had known I existed. Someone had tried to find me. I held the package against my chest and sat on the floor of that ruined cabin, and for the first time since my mother died, I cried. Not from sadness, not from fear, though I was afraid, from something I didn't have words for yet, something like recognition, something like being found. I didn't open the package that night. I couldn't. It felt too important to rush, too fragile, like if I handled it wrong, the connection might break. Instead, I wrapped myself in the moth-eaten blanket, lit a fire in the stove, the chimney drew poorly but worked, and read the first of the notebooks by candlelight. The handwriting was difficult at first, small and cramped, with abbreviations I didn't understand. But as I read, the voice behind the words came clear. October 2nd, 1854. The men in town told me I was a fool to buy this land. They said nothing grows here but willows and sorrow. Today I planted my first willow cutting along the creek bank. I told it, "They are wrong about you." Let me show them. Elspeth Crenshaw Whitmore, my grandmother. I had never known her name. My father never spoke of her except to say she was peculiar and that he'd left the mountains as soon as he was old enough to walk to the train station. He'd been dead for 3 years now, buried under half a mountain of collapsed coal mine. My mother had followed him 6 months later, coughing herself to death in the room where I'd been born. But my grandmother had been here, alive, working. For 32 years, if these notebooks were to be believed, she had studied this land and these willows and the way winter moved through these mountains. I read until my candle burned down to a stub and I had to stop. By then, I understood 3 things. First, my grandmother had not been crazy. She had been conducting experiments. Second, The wicker structures scattered across the property were not the work of a disordered mind. They were tests, prototypes, failed attempts and successful ones, documented with the precision of a scientist. And third, she had been trying to solve a problem that killed people in these mountains every winter: how to survive when the snow came. The next morning, I woke to cold so deep my breath hung visible above the blanket. The fire had died overnight. My fingers were stiff as I rebuilt it, stuffing kindling into the stove and blowing until the flames caught. The cabin warmed slowly. These walls had been leaking heat for 2 years, and they wouldn't hold it easily. I ate the last of the bread I'd brought from Grafton, half a loaf, hard and stale. I had no more food. I had 57 cents. The wagon ride had cost me 20 of the 77 I'd arrived with. That would buy cornmeal from town, maybe some salt. Not much else. But before I could worry about that, I needed to understand what my grandmother had left me. I read for 3 days straight, stopping only to gather firewood and melt snow for water. The notebook spanned 32 years of observations. Weather patterns recorded daily, temperature, wind direction, snowfall, the way snow accumulated on different surfaces. Willow cultivation notes: which varieties bent without breaking, which resisted rot, which grew fastest. Diagrams of bird nests with measurements of their curvature and calculations I didn't understand. Sketches of structures she'd seen in her youth, Cherokee winter shelters, she called them, built to shed snow rather than bear its weight. And then, in Notebook 7, dated March of 1867, the passage survived. 3 feet of snow overnight. The men from town said it would collapse. Virgil Hadley wrote up specifically to tell me it would collapse, as if I hadn't built it with my own hands and didn't understand its construction better than any man in Tucker County. Instead, the snow packed around the curved surface and made it stronger. The snow didn't crush the passage. The snow became part of the passage. I finally understand. We've been building wrong for 100 years. We build flat roofs that collect snow until the weight breaks them. We build straight walls that catch wind and transfer its force to the joints. We build against the mountain, and the mountain wins. But the birds don't build that way. The beavers don't build that way. The old ones who lived here before us didn't build that way. They build with the mountain. They build shapes that turn wind into reinforcement. They build curves that shed what they can't bear and integrate what they can. The wind does not need to be your enemy if you learn its shape. I read that line 3 times. Then I closed the notebook and walked outside to look at the wicker structures with new eyes. The collapsed ones, I now realized, were early experiments. The curved archway over the garden, still standing after 2 years of abandonment, was a later design. The tunnel leading to the woodshed was the most sophisticated of all. Even in its state of decay, I could see the logic. The curved walls, the way the path arched overhead, the angle that would shed snow rather than collect it. My grandmother had figured out how to build shelters that got stronger in winter. That used the snow and wind instead of fighting them. And she had spent 30 years trying to tell someone, anyone, what she'd learned. But no one had listened. They'd called her a witch instead. I found the entry about me on the 4th day. January 5th, 1882. I have written to the Methodist home about my granddaughter. I do not know if she's still there. I do not know if she is even alive. Harlan left these mountains at 18 and never wrote back. And now Harlan is dead and his wife is dead. And there is a girl, my son's daughter, my blood, growing up in an institution where no one will teach her what she needs to know. If she is there, if she reads this, I want her to know. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. They will tell you that nothing survives the cold. They are wrong about that too. The willows know. Finish what I started. Build the passage. Show them. Mrs. Hargrove had never told me. Never mentioned that my grandmother existed, let alone that she had written asking to meet me. For 3 years, I had been rotting in that gray building, scrubbing floors and learning to be invisible, and my grandmother had been here, waiting, hoping, trying to reach me. The package, the one addressed to me, the one that had been returned unopened. I went to the cedar chest and pulled it out. My hands were shaking as I tore the brown paper. Inside were 3 more notebooks, smaller than the others, newer. and a letter written in that same careful hand. Dear Cora, if you are reading this, then my letters have finally reached you, or else I am dead and you have found your way here on your own. Either way, these notebooks are for you. They contain everything I have learned about surviving winter in these mountains. Not the way everyone else does it, huddled in cabins, praying the roof holds, burning furniture when the woodpile runs out. My way, the way the willows taught me. I've written to the woman at your institution twice asking to meet you. She has not responded. I am 70 years old and I feel the cold deeper each winter. I do not know how much time I have left. But if you are reading this, then it was enough time. You are here. The notebooks are in your hands. Don't mourn for me, child. Finish what I started. Your grandmother, Elspeth. I sat on the floor of the cabin, the letter in my lap, and I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Mrs. Hargrove had known. She had received these letters, probably thrown them away, the same way she threw away anything that didn't fit her vision of how orphan girls should be raised. She had called this inheritance a cruel joke, but the only cruelty was her own. She had stolen 3 years from me, 3 years I could have had with the one person in the world who had wanted me. The anger came then, hot and sharp. I wanted to walk back to Grafton and say things to Mrs. Hargrove that would have gotten me locked in the punishment closet for a week. Instead, I opened the first of the new notebooks and started reading. By the end of the first week, I understood what my grandmother had built and why it mattered. I also understood that I had almost no chance of replicating it. Her designs required willow branches, thousands of them, harvested in late summer when the bark was still pliable. It was October. The willows along the creek had dropped their leaves. The branches were stiffening. I had maybe 2 weeks before they became too brittle to weave. Her designs required stone footings set below the frost line. I had no shovel, no pickaxe, no way to dig through the rocky soil without tools I couldn't afford. Her designs required mud plaster mixed with straw. I had no straw. The nearest farm was 4 miles away, and they weren't likely to give supplies to the witch's granddaughter. And more than any of that, her designs required time. Time to harvest and cure the willow. Time to dig and set the foundations. Time to weave and plaster and test. She had spent 32 years perfecting these techniques. I had maybe 6 weeks before the first serious snow. That night, I ate the last of the cornmeal I'd bought in Parsons. It was thin gruel, barely enough to stop my stomach from cramping. I had 37 cents left. Winter was coming, and I was alone on a mountain with a half-collapsed cabin, a chest full of notebooks I didn't know how to use, and skills I didn't have. The smart thing would be to leave. Walk back to Parsons, sell the land to whoever would buy it, and take the train to Baltimore for domestic service. That was what Mrs. Hargrove had suggested. That was what everyone expected. But then I looked at my grandmother's letter, still sitting on the table, and I thought about the passage she had built, the one she'd written about in Notebook 7, the one the men from town had said would collapse. It hadn't collapsed. The snow had made it stronger. Maybe she was right about that. And maybe, just maybe, she was right about me too. I nearly starved that first month. The details don't bear much telling. I learned to eat things I never would have considered food before. The inner bark of young willows, stripped and boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Acorns gathered from under oak trees, soaked for days to leach the bitterness out. Rabbit, when I was lucky enough to catch one in the snares, I built from willow bark, following diagrams my grandmother had sketched in Notebook 4. My clothes hung loose. I woke dizzy most mornings and had to sit for a while before I could stand. My hands cracked and bled from gathering firewood. I cried more than I want to admit, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that goes past the body into somewhere deeper. On day 9, I sat in the cabin watching rain leak through 3 different holes in the roof, and I thought seriously about leaving. I thought about the Methodist home, the gray walls, the thin mattresses, the smell of lye soap and disappointment, but also meals 3 times a day, a roof that didn't leak, the certainty of knowing exactly what each day would hold. I thought about domestic service in Baltimore, some rich family's kitchen, scrubbing their pots and sleeping in their attic, but also warm rooms, regular wages, a future that wasn't dying alone on a frozen mountain. I could leave, pack my carpet bag, walk down to Parsons, and admit that everyone had been right. The inheritance was a joke. The land was worthless. The grandmother I'd never met was just as crazy as they said. I reached for the notebooks to pack them. I wouldn't leave those behind, whatever else I did. And when I lifted the first one, it fell open to a page I hadn't read yet. March 18th, 1855. The worst part was the third week. I thought about leaving. I thought about going back to where it was warm and predictable, and everyone already knew I was a fool. Then I looked at the willows along the creek, and they were still standing. They had been through worse winters than this, worse storms, worse cold, and they hadn't left. They had bent, and they had survived, and when spring came, they would grow again. If they can stay, so can I. I closed the notebook. I looked out the window at the willows along the creek. They had shed their leaves, and their branches were bare and gray in the rain, but they were still there, still rooted, still standing. I didn't leave. The rabbit snares started working in the second week. I don't know why. Maybe I got better at setting them, or maybe the rabbits got careless. Either way, I went from starvation to something closer to survival. One rabbit every 3 or 4 days. Not enough to get fat on, but enough to keep moving. And I had to keep moving because I'd made a decision. I was going to build my grandmother's passage. The one she had designed but never perfected. The one connecting the cabin to the woodshed, an enclosed tunnel of woven willow, curved to shed snow, plastered to block wind. I started with the willows. The creek bank was dense with them. 30 years of my grandmother's cultivation, grown wild since her death. The branches ranged from finger-thin whips to trunks 3 inches across. My grandmother's notes said to harvest the whips for weaving and the trunks for the structural arches. I had no saw, so I used an old hatchet I found in the woodshed, its edge dull enough that each cut took a dozen strokes. I worked from dawn to dark, cut the branches, stripped the bark, bundled them for curing. My arms ached, my shoulders screamed, blisters rose on my palms, burst, and hardened into calluses. I lost count of how many bundles I made. 50, 100, more. It wasn't enough. My grandmother's diagrams called for thousands of branches, harvested over weeks and cured properly before use. I was doing everything wrong, harvesting too late in the season, not letting them cure long enough, working with materials that were too stiff and too few. But I kept working anyway, because stopping felt worse than failing. On the 18th day of construction, the storm came. Not a blizzard, not yet, but bad enough. The wind came up in the afternoon, gusting hard enough to push me sideways when I walked. By evening, the gusts had become a constant howl. I retreated to the cabin and listened to the walls creak. In the morning, everything I'd built was destroyed. The small windbreak I'd constructed behind the cabin, 6 feet of woven willow, my first attempt at my grandmother's designs, had been torn to pieces. Branches scattered across the clearing. The stakes I'd driven into the ground were pulled loose and thrown into the trees. I stood in the wreckage for a long time. The cold wind cut through my clothes, but I didn't move. 18 days of work, gone in one night. I thought about what Virgil Hadley had said, the shopkeeper in Parsons, the one who'd laughed at me when I bought my meager supplies. "You'll be frozen solid by February, girl." He was probably right. This was exactly what he had predicted, what everyone had predicted. The witch's granddaughter trying to build the witch's structures, failing the same way the witch had failed. I went back to the cabin and opened Notebook 8. November 3rd, 1862. The eastern section collapsed again last night, 4th time. The weave pattern I've been using doesn't provide enough flexibility at the anchor points. The structure can't absorb wind shear, so instead of bending, it breaks. I'm starting over. Again. I'm 50 years old, and I've been doing this for 8 years, and I still haven't built anything that survives a real storm. But each failure teaches me something. This one taught me about anchor points. Tomorrow I'll try a different approach. I read the entry 3 times. Then I went outside and started gathering the scattered branches. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. I had rebuilt the windbreak 4 times. each time adjusting based on what I'd learned from the failures. The anchor points needed to go deeper. The weave pattern needed more give at the base. The curve needed to be sharper at the peak so wind would flow over instead of pushing against. On the fourth attempt, I added something my grandmother hadn't tried, or at least hadn't recorded. Instead of driving wooden stakes into the ground, I dug down to the rocky subsoil and set my anchors into stones. The way buildings in town had stone foundations. It meant more digging with inadequate tools. I was using a sharp rock and a broken piece of iron I'd found in the woodshed, but it also meant the anchors couldn't be pulled loose. The night of November 19th, another storm came through. I lay awake listening to the wind scream and the walls flex, waiting for the sound of my work being destroyed. It didn't come. In the morning, I walked out to find the windbreak still standing. Snow had accumulated on the ground around it, but the curved surface had shed everything. The structure looked exactly as it had the day before. I stood there in the gray dawn light, my breath frosting the air, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. I felt powerful. I started on the passage that same day. The design was ambitious, my grandmother's most sophisticated structure, connecting the cabin's back door to the woodshed 23 feet away. A continuous woven archway, 4 feet wide at the base, 5 feet tall at the peak, plastered outside with mud and straw. A path you could walk through in any weather, reaching your firewood without ever stepping into the snow. I didn't have enough materials. I didn't have enough time. I didn't have the 32 years of experience my grandmother had accumulated. But I had her notebooks, and I discovered something about myself in these weeks of cold and hunger and failure. I was stubborn enough to keep going when any sensible person would have quit. I started with the stone footings, 6 of them, spaced along the path between cabin and woodshed. Each one meant digging through frozen ground to the rocky layer beneath 2 feet down, sometimes 3. My hands blistered and bled. My back seized up so badly some mornings I could barely stand. I broke 3 digging tools before I learned to wedge the rocks out instead of trying to pry them. But after 2 weeks, the footings were in place. 6 stone anchors packed with creek gravel for drainage, set below the frost line where they couldn't heave. Then the arches. My grandmother's notes specified willow trunks 3 to 4 inches thick, bent into curves and lashed to the footings. I had maybe a dozen trunks that met her specifications. It wasn't enough, so I improvised, bundling smaller branches together, wrapping them with strips of bark until they formed a composite trunk nearly as strong as a solid one. The bending was the hardest part. Green willow bends easily, but I was working with branches harvested too late in the season, already beginning to stiffen. I had to soak them in the creek for days, then heat them over the fire until the wood softened, then bend them quickly before they cooled. I burned myself more times than I could count. The scars on my arms are still visible today. By the first week of December, I had 12 arches installed, spaced 18 inches apart along the path, the skeleton of the passage. When I stood back and looked at it, I could see what my grandmother had envisioned. A tunnel, a bridge between buildings that would let winter happen around you instead of through you. Now I just had to finish it before the real cold came. The weaving took 3 weeks. I started each day at first light, working until my fingers were too numb to grip the branches, then inside to warm up, then back out again. I ate rabbit and acorn mush. I slept like I was drugged, 7 or 8 hours of unconsciousness broken by no dreams I could remember. My grandmother's notes described the weave pattern, tight at the base where snow and water would try to penetrate, looser at the peak where flexibility mattered more than density. I followed her diagrams exactly for the first 3 arches. Then I started making adjustments, the same way she had, based on what I learned by doing. The willow was more forgiving than I expected. Even the stiff branches from my too-late harvest bent when persuaded. The pattern emerged slowly, a basket large enough to walk through, woven from 3,000 branches I'd cut with my own hands. On December 15th, I wove the last branch into place. It didn't look like much. A strange tunnel made of sticks, arching between a half-ruined cabin and a listing woodshed. The neighbors would have laughed if they'd seen it. Virgil Hadley would have added it to his list of evidence that the Whitmore women were touched in the head. But when I walked inside, When I stood in the center of that passage and felt the wind cut off like a door closing, I knew. My grandmother had been right. They build against the mountain. I build with it. The next morning, I woke to snow. 8 inches fell overnight. I pulled on my boots and ran outside before I'd even properly dressed, my heart pounding with a fear I hadn't felt since the first windstorm. The passage was still standing. More than standing. The snow had slid off the curved surface and piled around the base, exactly as my grandmother had described. The inside was clear, dry. When I stepped through the entrance, the cold cut away like it had been waiting outside the door. I walked to the woodshed, filled my arms with firewood, walked back. I hadn't felt the wind once. I stood in the center of the passage, wood piled to my chin, and I laughed. The sound startled me. I hadn't laughed in so long I'd forgotten what it felt like, but I couldn't stop. I laughed until my stomach hurt and tears froze on my cheeks. When I finally caught my breath, I pressed my palm against the wicker wall and spoke to my grandmother. "You were right," I said. "You were right about everything." 3 days later, a man appeared at the edge of the clearing. I saw him from the window, a figure standing where the track emerged from the trees, not moving, just watching. My first thought was Jebediah Marsh, the timber speculator who'd tried to buy my land. My second thought was that I had no weapon and nowhere to run, but the figure didn't move toward the cabin. He just stood there, looking at the passage. I put on my coat and walked outside. He was old, 70 at least, maybe older. His face was weathered brown, seamed with lines that spoke of decades of mountain winters. He wore a canvas coat patched at the elbows and a hat so battered it had lost most of its original shape. When I got close enough to see his eyes, I found them fixed on the wicker passage with an expression I couldn't read. "You're Harlan's girl," he said. Not a question. "Meet Cora Whitmore." "I know who you are." He still hadn't looked at me. "I've been watching you work for about 3 weeks now, from the timberline. Wanted to see what you'd do with her notebooks." "You knew my grandmother?" He nodded slowly. "Knew her. Courted her, back before she married your grandfather. Lost to a man with more money and less sense. Didn't stop me from visiting, though. We played checkers on that porch for 30 years. He finally turned to look at me. "She built a passage just like that one back in '62, back of the woodshed, where yours is." "I know. I read her notes. It collapsed twice before she got the design right, third time held." He stepped closer to the passage, reached out one gnarled hand, and pressed it against the woven willow. "This one's better, though. You fixed the drainage problem she never solved. The way you've angled the base, water will run out instead of pooling and freezing." I hadn't thought of it that way. I just noticed that my grandmother's base sat flat while the ground sloped, so I'd tilted my footings to match the terrain. "I'm Amos Sutner," the man said. "I do stonework. Foundations mostly. Helped build the railroad through these mountains back when I was young and stupid enough to think that was a good idea." He looked at me. "Your grandmother wasn't crazy. She was 30 years ahead of everyone else, and she left you everything she learned." He paused. "The question is whether you've got the sand to use it." "I've got sand," I said. He smiled, just the corner of his mouth, barely visible in his beard. "I can see that. How about you show me the inside of this thing before I freeze my boots solid?" Amos stayed for dinner that night, and for breakfast the next morning, and for the next 3 months of my life. He didn't move into the cabin. He had his own place down the mountain, a small stone house he'd built himself, but he came every day, arriving at dawn and leaving at dusk. He taught me things I couldn't have learned from notebooks: how to read the soil by its color and smell, how to set stones so they locked together without mortar, how to feel a storm coming 2 days before it arrived. "Your grandmother was brilliant," he told me one evening, warming his hands by the stove. "But she was book brilliant, theory. She understood why things worked, but she didn't always know how to make them work. That's where you're different. You've got her mind and something else hands that want to build." I didn't know if that was true, but I kept building anyway. With Amos's help, I finished the mud plastering on the passage. 40 buckets of creek bank mud mixed with straw, applied in thin layers that dried hard as plaster. The wind couldn't find a way through. The passage became a corridor of still air, 34 degrees year-round, indifferent to what happened outside. By Christmas, we had started on the secondary structures, a curved windbreak around the garden plot to extend the growing season, a small shed woven in the same style as the passage, testing whether the design could work as a standalone building. By the new year, I'd stopped losing weight. The rabbit snares produced more now. Amos knew tricks I didn't, and he'd brought supplies from his own stores. Not charity, he insisted. Investment. Your grandmother was onto something real, he said. Something that could save lives in these mountains. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to figure it out, and now here you are. But even as my situation improved, I knew the real test hadn't come yet. The passage had survived 8 inches of snow. It had survived December winds that rattled the cabin walls. But my grandmother's notebooks described winters where the snow reached 12 feet, winds that knocked down barns, cold that killed livestock in their stalls. The White Death, the old-timers called it, the storm that came without warning and killed without mercy. Amos felt it coming before anyone else. Something big, he said one morning in early January, rubbing his knees. Bigger than anything I've felt in 50 years, maybe bigger than anything ever. I looked at my passage, 23 feet of woven willow and mud, the work of 4 months of my life. It seemed small suddenly, fragile. Will it hold? I asked. Amos didn't answer. But his silence told me what I needed to know. He didn't know either. Nobody did. My grandmother had built passages that survived normal winters. But what was coming wasn't a normal winter. I checked my wood pile. I checked my food stores. I walked through the passage 3 times looking for weaknesses. Then I waited. Amos came every day that week, even when the cold made his joints ache so badly he could barely climb the path. He taught me things that weren't in my grandmother's notebooks, the practical knowledge that comes from 70 years of living in these mountains. He showed me how to read ice patterns on the creek to predict temperature drops, how to bank a fire so it would burn slow and hot through the night, how to tell the difference between a passing squall and the leading edge of something worse. The air changes, he said, standing in the passage one afternoon. Before a real storm, the air gets heavy, like it's waiting for something. I asked him once about his connection to my grandmother. We were sitting by the stove sharing the last of a rabbit stew, and he got quiet in a way that made me wish I hadn't asked. I loved her, he said finally. Back when we were young, she was the smartest person I ever knew, man or woman, and she had this way of looking at the world that made everything seem interesting, like the whole mountain was a puzzle she was trying to solve. But she married my grandfather. She did. Samuel Whitmore had money and land, and I had nothing but a strong back and a stonemason's apprenticeship. Her parents made the choice for her. He stared into the fire. Samuel died in '53. Logging accident. She could have married again, plenty of men would have had her, but she came up here instead. Said she wanted to do something that mattered more than being someone's wife. Did you ever tell her how you felt? Amos smiled, the sad kind of smile that has more grief in it than happiness. I visited her for 30 years, played checkers on that porch, listened to her talk about wind patterns and snow loads and why the Cherokee built their shelters the way they did. I think she knew. He paused. I think she knew, and she was grateful I never said it out loud. It would have made things complicated, and Elspeth didn't like complicated. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, I lost my wife and boy in the blizzard of '59, same way your grandmother died, near enough. Roof collapsed, couldn't get out. I dug through 6 feet of snow to reach them, and by the time I did, he stopped, swallowed. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to figure out how to keep that from happening again. Your grandmother was close, and now here you are. I didn't know what to say, so I reached out and put my hand on his arm, and we sat there in silence while the fire crackled and the wind moaned outside. That was the night I understood something important. Amos wasn't just helping me build structures. He was trying to finish something he'd started decades ago, a debt to the woman he'd loved and the family he'd lost. We were both building with ghosts. January brought the deepest cold I'd ever known. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The creek froze solid. The water bucket in the cabin developed ice around the edges overnight, even with the stove burning. I wore every piece of clothing I owned and still shivered, but the passage held. The snow packed around it and turned the structure into something that looked like a frozen wave. Inside, the temperature stayed above freezing, barely, but enough. I walked to the woodshed every morning in my grandmother's old slippers, the ones I'd found in the cedar chest. My feet stayed warm. My hands stayed dry. The wind couldn't touch me. Amos brought his nephew Thomas to see it in the first week of January. Thomas was maybe 30, a skeptic by nature, the kind of man who believed in what he could see and not much else. He stood at the entrance of the passage and refused to go in. "It's a trick," he said. "Some kind of trick." "Walk through it," Amos told him. Thomas walked through, 23 feet from cabin to woodshed. When he emerged on the other side, his face had changed. "It's warm," he said. "How is it warm? There's no fire. There's no—" He looked at the wicker walls, at the packed snow, at the still air inside. "It's like walking inside a living thing." "It's physics," I said. "The shape sheds wind. The snow insulates. The enclosed space holds heat." Thomas shook his head slowly. "My grandmother talked about the Cherokee shelters, how they'd survive winters that killed settlers in their cabins. I always thought she was exaggerating." "She wasn't," Amos said, "and neither was Elspeth Whitmore. This girl's finished what her grandmother started, and if what I'm feeling in my knees is right, we're all going to be grateful for it before the month is out." I went to town on January 4th to trade rabbit pelts for lamp oil and salt. The general store was warm and crowded. Half the town had come in to escape the cold and share news. Virgil Hadley stood behind the counter, counting out change for a woman I didn't recognize. When he saw me, his face did something complicated. "Still alive up there, are you?" "Still alive. Heard you've been building." He said the word like it tasted bad. "More of your grandmother's bird nests." I set my pelts on the counter. "I need lamp oil and salt." "What will these buy me?" Hadley examined the pelts with exaggerated care. "These are fair quality. I'll give you 40 cents credit." The pelts were worth at least 70 cents. I knew it. He knew I knew it. But I didn't have anywhere else to trade, and he knew that too. "Fine." He measured out my supplies, taking his time. The other customers watched, some curious, some hostile, some just bored. A woman near the stove muttered something I couldn't hear. Someone laughed. "You know what we call that property," Hadley said as he wrapped my salt in paper. "The Widowmaker. 3 families tried to work it before your grandmother. All dead or gone within 2 years. I know what you call it. You'll be frozen solid by February, girl." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I suppose some people have to learn the hard way. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?" I picked up my supplies. I looked at Hadley, at his red face and his small eyes, and his certainty that he knew everything worth knowing. "My grandmother survived 32 winters on that land," I said. "She only died because her cabin roof collapsed. The same kind of roof everyone in this town uses. The same kind of roof you have over this store." I turned toward the door. "I hope your roof holds, Mr. Hadley. I really do." I walked out into the cold. Behind me I heard someone say, "Touched, just like the old woman." The blizzard came on January 12th. I've lived through many storms since then, bad ones, famous ones, storms that got names and made the newspapers. But I've never experienced anything like the White Death of '88. It started with the air. Amos had told me to watch for it, and he was right. The air changed, got heavy, got still. The birds disappeared, the rabbits stopped moving. Even the wind died down like the mountain was holding its breath. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and green, colors that didn't belong together. The temperature, which had been around 15 degrees, started dropping. 20 degrees in 2 hours. Then 10 more. I brought extra wood into the cabin. checked the passage one more time, fed the fire until the stove glowed red. At 4 in the afternoon, the storm hit. It didn't build slowly. It arrived all at once, a wall of wind and snow that came over the ridge like something alive. One moment, I could see the trees at the edge of the clearing. The next moment, I couldn't see the woodshed 20 feet away. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the howl of normal wind, but a roar, constant, enormous, like standing next to a waterfall. The cabin walls flexed, the stovepipe rattled. I sat in the chair by the fire and watched the gaps in the chinking turn white with driven snow. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think anyone in Tucker County slept that night. By dawn, 3 feet of snow had fallen. By noon, 6 feet. The drifts against the cabin walls reached the windowsills. I couldn't see out anymore, just white, pressing against the glass like something trying to get in. The passage. I needed to check the passage. I pushed open the back door, or tried to. It moved 3 inches and stopped. Snow had piled against it during the night. I put my shoulder against the wood and shoved. The door moved another inch. I shoved again. Again. Finally, a gap wide enough to squeeze through. The passage was buried. The entrance was just a dark hole in a wall of white. I crawled through on my hands and knees, snow collapsing around me, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Inside, the passage was intact. More than intact. The wicker walls were solid under their coating of ice. The packed snow around the structure had become part of the structure, an insulating shell that blocked the wind completely. The inside temperature was 36 degrees. Outside it was 15 below zero and falling. I walked to the woodshed, filled my arms with firewood, walked back. I hadn't felt the wind once. The storm lasted 48 hours. I know now what was happening in the rest of the valley during those 2 days. The Brennan family, half a mile down the mountain, spent the first day burning furniture after their woodshed door drifted over. The Petersons, in their cabin near the creek, heard their roof groaning under the snow load and spent the second night huddled in the cellar, waiting for the collapse that never quite came. Virgil Hadley's store lost 3 windows to the wind. The widow Pearson, alone in her cabin, ran out of firewood on the second day and was found nearly frozen when her grandson finally dug through to her. And somewhere on the exposed ridge above the valley, 2 of Jebediah Marsh's timber crew froze to death when their logging camp collapsed. I didn't know any of this at the time. I knew only what I could see. Snow falling so thick it turned the world to white, wind that screamed without stopping, and my passage, holding steady while the mountain tried to tear it apart. On the second night, I heard a sound that wasn't wind, a crash, distant but distinct, the sound of a roof giving way. Someone's house, someone's shelter, someone who was now exposed to the killing cold. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even get out of my own cabin, let alone reach anyone else. I sat by the fire and listened to the storm and thought about all the people in the valley who were doing the same thing, sitting, waiting, hoping their roofs would hold. My grandmother had spent 30 years trying to solve this problem. 30 years of experiments and failures, and small successes that no one else cared about. She had died alone in this cabin, buried under the same kind of snow that was burying the valley now. But she had also left behind 17 notebooks, diagrams, instructions. Everything she had learned preserved in a cedar chest that the snow hadn't crushed. And I had built her passage. If I survived this, if anyone survived this, I was going to make sure her work didn't die with me. The storm broke on the morning of January 14th. I woke to silence. Not the muffled quiet of falling snow, but true silence, the kind that comes when the wind finally stops. I lay in bed for a long moment, not quite believing it. Then I got up and dug my way outside. The world had been transformed. The valley was buried under 12 feet of snow. Drifts reached 20 feet in some places, shaped by the wind into frozen waves. The trees at the edge of the clearing were buried to their lower branches. The road didn't exist anymore, just a smooth white plain where it used to be. I could see roof lines poking up from the drifts, some intact, some caved inward, dark holes where homes used to be. The passage had held. It rose from the snow like a frozen tunnel, its entrance clear, its walls solid under their shell of ice. I walked through it to the woodshed and back. My feet stayed dry. My hands stayed warm. Then I climbed to the top of the nearest drift and looked out at what was left of Tucker County. Mrs. Brennan came first. I saw her struggling up the mountain around noon, a dark figure against the white, moving slowly, falling and getting up and falling again. It took her an hour to cover what should have been a 10-minute walk. By the time she reached my clearing, her lips were blue and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely stand. She had wrapped herself in a blanket that was more ice than wool. Her eyes were wild. "Please," she said, "my children. I know what I said about you. I know what I called your grandmother. But my children, they're dying. We have no wood. We burned everything." I thought about last summer, when I'd walked down to the Brennan place to ask about buying eggs. Mrs. Brennan had looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, not just suspicion, but something closer to disgust. "I don't sell to the witch's kin," she'd said. "Find your eggs somewhere else." I thought about her children, 2 of them, a boy around 8 and a girl maybe 5. I'd seen them playing in their yard once, chasing a dog in circles. I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "Bring your family. There's room." Mrs. Brennan started crying, not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes when you've been holding yourself together for too long and you finally can't anymore. She grabbed my hand and pressed it to her frozen face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, thank you. Go get your family. I'll have the fire built up when you get back." They came in 1s and 2s at first. The Brennans, the widow Pearson's grandson, carrying his grandmother on his back. A family I didn't recognize from the lower valley, the Suttons, it turned out, who had lost half their cabin to the snow and had nowhere else to go. By the 3rd day, I had 12 people in my cabin, and more coming. I moved everyone I couldn't fit inside into the woodshed, which was cold but dry. I shared my food, rabbit, and acorn mush, not much, but enough to keep people alive. I showed them the passage, explained how it worked, watched their faces change from skepticism to wonder. Virgil Hadley came on the 4th day. His store roof had partially collapsed, and he'd spent 2 nights in his cellar. He stood at the edge of my clearing, hat in hands, unable to meet my eyes. "I need help," he said. "My wife is sick." The cold got into her chest. I remembered what he'd said in the store. Frozen solid by February. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree. "Bring her up," I said. "There's room by the fire." Hadley looked at me then, really looked for maybe the first time. After everything I said, "The fire doesn't know what you said. Neither does the passage." He brought his wife up that afternoon. She recovered. He never quite apologized, that wasn't his way, but he never called me a witch again either. Jebediah Marsh came last. I was standing in the passage when I saw him climbing the mountain, unmistakable even at a distance, with his expensive coat and his city man's walk. He was struggling badly. The snow was chest deep in places, and he wasn't dressed for it. He'd tried to have me declared unfit. He'd spread rumors that I was practicing witchcraft. He told me I'd be begging him to buy my land by Christmas. Now he was the one coming to beg. He reached the clearing and stopped, breathing hard. His face was red with cold and something else, shame, maybe, or just exhaustion. "2 of my men are dead," he said. "The camp collapsed. The others have frostbite. I need—" He stopped, swallowed. "I need shelter, supplies, whatever you can spare." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had tried to take everything from me, who had wished me dead, who had called my grandmother a witch and meant it as a curse. "The woodshed has what you need," I said. "Take what will keep your men alive." Marsh opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. He took the supplies and left. I never saw him in Tucker County again. I heard later that his timber speculation business failed. Too many harsh winters, too much damaged equipment. He went back to Clarksburg and never returned. I can't say I was sorry to see him go. Amos watched all of this from his chair by the fire. His cough had gotten worse during the blizzard, a deep rattling sound that shook his whole body. He was too weak to help with the work, but he watched. And on the third night, when most of the refugees were asleep, he called me over. "They don't deserve it, you know," he said. "Not after everything they said." I was stirring a pot of soup, thin stuff, mostly water and wild onion, but warm. Maybe not. Then why? I thought about it. Thought about my grandmother's notebooks, about the passage she'd built that nobody appreciated until she was dead, about the 30 years she'd spent trying to solve a problem that people would rather die from than admit she was right about. "The passage doesn't know who mocked me and who didn't," I said finally. "The fire doesn't know either. And I think," I paused, looking at the people crowded into the cabin, at the children sleeping in corners, at Mrs. Brennan holding her daughter against the cold. "I think that's how it should be." Amos smiled, that sad smile again with the grief still in it. "Your grandmother would have said the same thing," he said, word for word. The aftermath of the blizzard lasted 6 weeks. Roads had to be dug out. Collapsed buildings had to be salvaged or torn down. 3 families had lost people, 2 of Marsh's timber crew, and an elderly man on the other side of the valley who'd frozen in his bed. But as the weeks passed and the immediate crisis faded, something else emerged. People started asking about the passage. How did it work? Could they build one? Would I teach them? I taught them. Every family that asked. I showed them how to harvest willow, how to set stone footings, how to weave the arches so they'd bend instead of break. I drew diagrams based on my grandmother's notebooks. I answered questions until my voice went hoarse. By summer, 3 families in Tucker County had started building wicker passages of their own. By the next winter, 14. Professor Needham came back from Morgantown with a photographer and a notebook full of questions. He wrote a paper for the University Bulletin, Indigenous Construction Techniques in Appalachian Winter Shelter, that credited my grandmother by name. Engineers from Pittsburgh came to study the passage. A journalist from Wheeling wrote an article that got reprinted in newspapers as far as Philadelphia. They called me the Wicker Woman of Tucker County. I didn't mind. There were worse things to be called. Mrs. Hargrove came in the summer of 1889. I was in the garden, the one I'd built inside a wicker windbreak, extending the growing season by 2 months, when I heard a wagon on the road. I straightened up, wiped the dirt from my hands, and watched as a small woman in a gray traveling dress climbed down and walked toward the cabin. I recognized her immediately. The steel gray bun, the tight skin at her temples, the permanent expression of mild distaste. "Cora," she said. "Just my name. No Miss Whitmore. No formality. Mrs. Hargrove." She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. She was carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, and her hands were shaking slightly. "I came to return this," she said. "Your grandmother sent it. I told myself I was protecting you from false hope. Now I think I was protecting myself from having to explain why I'd been wrong about her." She held out the package. I didn't take it. "I found most of it in the cedar chest," I said. "The notebooks, the letters, the package addressed to me that was never delivered." Mrs. Hargrove flinched like I'd struck her. "I know. I read about you in the newspaper, the Wicker Woman of Tucker County. They said you learned everything from your grandmother's journals." She paused. "They said she tried to contact you years ago. She wrote twice. You never told me." "No." Mrs. Hargrove's voice was barely above a whisper. "I wrote back and told her you were placed with a Christian family and didn't need contact with irregular mountain people. I told myself it was for your own good." "Was it?" "No." She finally looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time in all the years I'd known her. "It was because I believed what everyone said about her, that she was crazy, that her land was worthless, that she had nothing to offer you." She held up the package again. "This was supposed to be delivered to you directly. She sent it after I refused to let her visit. I sent it back unopened. Her voice broke. "I was wrong, Cora. I was wrong about everything. I looked at the package, at Mrs. Hargrove's shaking hands, at the woman who had stolen 3 years from me, who had kept me from the one person in the world who had wanted me, who had called my inheritance a cruel joke. I could have refused, could have turned away and left her standing there with her guilt. Part of me wanted to, but I thought about the passage, about the fire that didn't know who mocked me and who didn't, about my grandmother who had spent 30 years trying to solve a problem that people would rather die from than admit she was right about. I forgive you, I said. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is like carrying stones uphill. It gets heavier the longer you hold it. And I've got enough to carry. Mrs. Hargrove started crying. I took the package from her hands and let her come inside. Amos died in February of 1889, a year after the Great Blizzard. He'd caught pneumonia helping dig out a neighbor's collapsed cabin. The cold got into his lungs and wouldn't leave. I begged him to go to town for doctoring, but he refused. "If I'm going to die," he said, "I'll die where I can see her work through the window." His last afternoon, he sat in the chair by the fire, watching snow fall on the Wicker passage. He told me that Elspeth would be proud. He told me to say hello to her when I saw her. Then he closed his eyes. The soup on the table was still warm when I realized he wasn't breathing. I buried him on the rise overlooking the passage, where he'd like to sit on summer evenings. I planted willow cuttings on his grave, the same variety my grandmother had cultivated for 30 years. I read aloud from her notebooks until the sun set, so he could hear her words one more time. He left me his cabin and his tools. A letter explaining that he'd never married again after losing his wife and son, that helping me finish Elspeth's work was the first thing that had given his life meaning in 30 years. I still visit his grave every spring when the willows are blooming. I married Thomas Suttner in the spring of 1891, Amos's nephew, the skeptic who had walked through my passage and emerged believing. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked, who asked questions instead of giving answers, who understood that the work I was doing mattered and never asked me to stop doing it. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They grew up knowing how to weave willow and read snow and build things that worked with the mountain instead of against it. The passage expanded, first on our land, then across the county. By 1900, there were wicker structures throughout the high Alleghenies. By 1910, variations had spread to Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Dakotas. Professor Needham's paper was cited in engineering journals for decades. My grandmother's name is on a plaque at West Virginia University now. Elspeth Crenshaw Whitmore, 1812 to 1885. Pioneer of adaptive shelter design. I dedicated it myself 50 years after she died. I taught until I was 70 years old. My hands knew the willows the way a pianist knows a keyboard. Every variety, every bend, every way to coax a branch into holding weight it shouldn't be able to bear. I buried my husband. I buried my son, who died in the Second War, on a beach in France. I watched my daughters grow old and my grandchildren grow up, and the world change into something my grandmother wouldn't have recognized. But the passage remained. The one I built that first desperate winter, when I had nothing and knew nothing and was too stubborn to die. It's been rebuilt twice, improved each time. My great-granddaughter maintains it now. The willows are still growing. I died on a Tuesday morning in April of 1957. That's a strange thing to say about yourself, I died. But I'm telling this story from somewhere outside of it, looking back, so I might as well be honest about how it ends. It was spring. The willows along the creek were budding, that first pale green that means winter is finally over. I had been in bed for 3 weeks. My heart was giving out. The doctor said, nothing to be done but rest and wait. I woke early that morning before dawn and lay there listening to the birds. A cardinal was singing in the old oak by the passage. It reminded me of my first spring on this mountain, when I'd been so hungry I'd thought about eating birds if I could catch one. I thought about my grandmother, about Amos, about Thomas and my children, and all the people who had passed through that passage over the years. I closed my eyes. They found me later that morning, still in bed, facing the window where I could see the passage. My granddaughter said I looked peaceful, like I was listening to something only I could hear. The notebook is still there. My grandmother's notebook, the one with the thematic quote, the one I read that first night in the ruined cabin. My great-granddaughter found it in the cedar chest after I died and had the passage framed and mounted in the County Historical Society. They build against the mountain. I build with it. The wind does not need to be your enemy if you learn its shape. People read it sometimes. Visitors who come to see the original passage, now preserved as a historical site, students from the university, engineers researching old construction techniques. I wonder what they make of it, whether they understand what it meant, what it still means, whether they hear my grandmother's voice in those words, the way I did. Mrs. Hargrove called my inheritance a cruel joke. She wasn't entirely wrong. It was cruel, in a way, to give a 16-year-old girl with nothing a ruined cabin and a reputation for madness. But it wasn't a joke. It was a gift, the only inheritance that ever mattered. So let me ask you something. What passage have you been afraid to build? I don't mean a literal passage. You probably don't have willows on your land or snow to contend with. But you have something. We all do. Some strange structure waiting in your mind, dismissed because the people around you don't understand it. Some idea that everyone else says is worthless. Some inheritance of talent, of stubbornness, of seeing things differently that you've been told to ignore. What willows are waiting on your land? What notebooks are sitting in your cedar chest, unread? What grandmother's work is waiting to be finished? I was 16 years old when I arrived on this mountain with 77 cents and a carpetbag full of stolen library bulletins. Everyone who knew me said I would fail. The matron of the orphanage, the shopkeeper in town, the timber speculator who wanted my land. Even the wagon driver who dropped me 2 miles from my destination said I wouldn't last the winter. They were wrong. Not because I was special, I wasn't. Not because I was lucky, I nearly starved that first month. They were wrong because they were measuring the wrong things. They looked at the collapsed cabin and the strange wicker structures and the land that wouldn't grow crops, and they saw worthlessness. They didn't see what my grandmother had seen, what the willows knew. The wind does not need to be your enemy if you learn its shape. That's not just a construction principle. It's a way of living. The obstacles in your path, the people who doubt you, the resources you don't have, the time you think you've run out of, they're only obstacles if you build against them, if you fight them the way everyone expects you to fight them. But if you learn their shape, if you figure out how they move and what they want and how to work with them instead of against them, they become part of your structure. They make you stronger. That's what my grandmother figured out in 32 years on this mountain. That's what I learned in my first winter, watching the snowpack around my passage and realizing that the thing everyone said would destroy me was actually holding me up. And that's what I'm telling you now, looking back from the end of my story. The people who mocked you don't get to decide what you build. The voices telling you it's worthless don't get to decide what has value. The obstacles in your path don't get to decide whether you pass through. You do. If this story moves something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves and rusted keys and passages waiting to be woven, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. Because that's what this is, really. That's what all of these stories are. Not about geniuses or heroes or people who had everything handed to them. About people like my grandmother, like me, like you. People who inherited worthless things and found the worth hiding inside. Your grandmother was right about you, you know. Whoever told you that you weren't enough, that your ideas were strange, that the thing you love is worthless, they were wrong. They were measuring the wrong things. Looking at the surface when the real value was buried underneath. The willows are growing. Start weaving.